They called him the man behind nightmares, a figure so disturbing, so psychologically fractured that decades after his crimes, his legacy still seeps into pop culture, true crime lore, and horror cinema. His name wasn't whispered on LA streets or tied to Sunset Boulevard. He never lived in a mansion, never made headlines in Hollywood tabloids, but in a chilling twist of fate, Hollywood couldn't stop telling his story, over and over again. His name was Edward Theodore Gein, and though his crimes happened in rural Wisconsin, not Los Angeles, the brutal reality of what he did gave birth to three of the most haunting horror films of the 20th century: Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. He wasn't prolific, but he was unforgettable. Gein was born in 1906, just outside of La Crosse, Wisconsin. His childhood was marked by extreme isolation and abuse. His father was a violent alcoholic. His mother, Augusta, was a religious fanatic who taught her two sons that women were inherently sinful and that the world was full of evil. They were forbidden from making friends. The family eventually moved to a remote farmhouse in Plainfield, where the boys were cut off from nearly all human contact. Ed, in particular, grew deeply dependent on his mother. When she died in 1945, something in him broke, permanently. Alone in the decaying farmhouse, Ed Gein began slipping into fantasy. He sealed off the rooms his mother had once used, preserving them like a shrine. The rest of the home turned to rot. What followed wasn't a killing spree, but something arguably more disturbing. Between the late 1940s and early 1950s, Gein began robbing local graves. He admitted to making nocturnal trips to local cemeteries where he would dig up freshly buried women who resembled his mother. He'd take their remains, mostly skin and body parts, back to his house, fashioning furniture, masks, and clothing out of the corpses. These were not urban legends. When police searched his home in 1957, they found chairs upholstered with human skin, skulls on bedposts, a lampshade made from a human face, and a belt made entirely of nipples. His refrigerator contained preserved human organs. It was a real-life house of horrors, silent, rural, and terrifyingly real. Despite the grotesque inventory inside his home, Gein was only ever convicted of a single murder, that of hardware store owner Bernice Warden, whose son, a sheriff's deputy, had grown suspicious after she vanished, and Gein was spotted near her store. When police entered his home, they discovered her decapitated body hanging upside down in a shed, gutted like livestock. Gein later confessed to the murder of another woman, Mary Hogan, 3 years earlier, but because of his severe mental illness, he was deemed unfit for trial and committed to a psychiatric institution, where he spent the rest of his life. He died in 1984. His kill count? Officially, 2. But his legacy was something else entirely. What Gein lacked in body count, he made up for in psychological impact. His crimes were unlike anything law enforcement or the public had ever seen. He wasn't a hitman, a gangster, or a thrill killer. He was a loner, obsessed with his mother, consumed by a desire to become her, and fueled by delusion. His case shocked the nation, not because of how many he killed, but because of what he did with the remains. In that terrifying, surreal space between murder and madness, Hollywood found inspiration. The first to tap into Ed's darkness was novelist Robert Bloch, who lived just 35 miles from Plainfield and wrote the novel Psycho in 1959, inspired by news reports of the case. A year later, Alfred Hitchcock adapted it into the now iconic film. Norman Bates, the soft-spoken motel clerk with mother issues, is a direct echo of Gein. The dual identity, the preserved corpse, the descent into delusion. It wasn't a biopic, but the DNA was undeniable. Psycho changed horror forever. It replaced the monster with the man, suggesting that real horror might live next door. In 1974, director Tobe Hooper crafted The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a film drenched in sweat, fear, and rural dread. While it wasn't a literal retelling of Ed's crimes, the character of Leatherface, who wears human skin and decorates his home with bones, was inspired by the same forensic photos that shocked the world in 1957. Hooper has said in interviews that Gein's crimes planted the seed for the film's grotesque aesthetic: a family of cannibals, a slaughterhouse of human remains, and a landscape soaked in madness. Once again, Ed Gein's legacy re-emerged, not as a human being, but as an idea. Then came The Silence of the Lambs in 1991. Though much of the film focuses on the brilliant and terrifying Hannibal Lecter, it was Buffalo Bill, the serial killer who skins his victims to make a woman's suit, who drew directly from Gein's history. The idea of killing to transform, of building identity through skin, was not fiction. It was an echo of what had already happened in that Wisconsin farmhouse. The film, which won 5 Academy Awards, brought Ed's shadow back into the mainstream, without ever saying his name. In all 3 films, the essence of Ed Gein's horror wasn't the number of victims, it was the psychology, the disturbing intimacy, the way grief twisted into obsession, the desecration of the body not as spectacle, but as artifice. And in doing so, Hollywood reshaped the horror genre. The monster wasn't always a demon. Sometimes it was a man with a soft voice, a lonely house, and too much silence. Today, Gein's legacy lives on through pop culture more than any other serial killer with such a low confirmed body count. True crime documentaries dissect his case. Podcasts speculate on his psychology. Writers, directors, and artists return to his story again and again, trying to understand how someone so ordinary could become something so unimaginable. His farmhouse was demolished, but the artifacts remain in storage. Some museums still display items tied to the investigation, though they remain controversial. What makes Ed Gein's story so haunting is not just the gore, it's the proximity, the way he slipped through the cracks, the way people in his small town thought he was odd but harmless, and the way his crimes continued to influence our nightmares long after he disappeared behind the walls of a mental hospital. Hollywood never met Ed Gein, but it couldn't stop telling his story, because in a business built on illusion, he reminded us that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the monster hiding in the dark, it's the man next door, with a shovel, a locked door, and a smile.